Hey everyone, what's up? And welcome back to the very first strategical lesson of the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course. In the previous episode, you learned the starting point of this course and I gave you some insights in what you can expect. And today we're actually going to get things started. As the first lesson is, we're going to focus on a big blind topic. It's about pre-flop and we're going to look into defending the big blind out of position versus one raiser. This is an extremely important topic because it happens super often and many of you are probably making quite some mistakes in here. We're going to focus on first some principles when it comes to how a GTO solution should be played, how the population is playing, and then later on in this lesson I will show you some hand examples of hands that you actually should not continue with in the big blind here. Okay, let's start off with this first lesson. First of all, I want to compare stakes with all of you. So what you're seeing here is a table of content with information and numbers about the GTO outcomes sitting in the big blind versus various positions. So what you can see is we have a low, a mid, and a high stakes column here. And on the left side, you see the positions. So we see big blind versus early position, 14% at low stakes, meaning from the big blind versus an early position RFI at low stakes / high rake, we should call 14% of the time. If we play big blind versus early position on mid stakes, we should call 19.90% of the time. If we play big blind versus early position in high stakes / low rake relatively, we should call 28.20% of the time here. So massive differences. And you can also see these differences adding up versus other positions. So if you look big blind versus cutoff, you see the same pattern. We call less at low stakes and we call more at high stakes. Big blind versus button, similar principles. We call less at low stakes and at high stakes we call much more. The difference there is almost 20%. Big blind versus small blind, we see something of 57.7% of the time calling at low stakes, at mid stakes 65%, and at high stakes 75%. So one pattern here is very clear, and that is that we should cold call much less often if you play low stakes / high rakes, comparing this to mid or high stakes. It is very clear here that this is because of the rake. Because the rake is higher at low stakes, it is less beneficial for us to enter a pot without fold equity, and therefore we should be much more selective. When the rake is relatively lower, such as on high stakes, for example, we can be more liberate here and call much more hands because the rake has less of an impact. It will eat less of the pot, and therefore there is more money into the pot to be won, basically. But if the rake has a super high impact, our cold call strategy should be much different than other scenarios here. And that is the first takeaway I would all give you here. And that is, if you watch, for example, someone playing mid stakes or high stakes, for example, on YouTube or on Twitch or any other time, basically, always keep in mind that especially when it comes to cold calling, the strategy at those stakes is significantly different because the rake is different. And therefore, hands that you see sometimes people there cold calling is not necessarily hand that you want to cold call if you actually play the small stakes. So keep that in mind. The differences here are huge. You can see them again. You can pause the video or take a screenshot of it. If not, we're going to move on to the next section here. And the next section here is about population tendencies. So we just learned the GTO outcomes. You can see them here again in the middle. GTO, call big blind versus early position, 14%. We just saw that. Big blind versus MP, 19.8 versus cutoff, 23.6, etc. These numbers you just saw. But now let's look at how the population is actually playing in the big blind and what the differences are. On the right side here, you can see the population tendencies, and you can see that there are actually quite some differences to be made here. Especially when you think about the call from the big blind out of position versus early position until the button, you can see that the frequencies here are very, very similar. They are 31.2% versus an early position open that we're cold calling in the big blind, 29.5 versus MP, 28.6 versus cutoff, and 29.7 versus the button. So what does this mean for you? What does this mean for the overall strategy here? It means that if someone is sitting in the big blind, he doesn't really notice or pay attention to the fact where the RFI player is raising from. So whether he's raising from early position or from the button, it doesn't really matter. It seems that he is cold calling the same amount of hands no matter what. and that is around 30%. Secondly, he's not at all aware of the fact that the rake is high, meaning he should be much tighter in most of these situations, but he's not doing that. And that means that he has little awareness of the rake impact and the fact that a lot of the money that he's gonna call from is gonna get taken away from the poker side, as we call it rake. So keep that in mind. This is extremely important. And also keep that in mind whenever you are the one open raising from any of these positions and someone in the big blind is calling. It's very likely that this player is actually calling more than he should. And this can have an impact on your post-flop strategy, of course. Okay, let's continue here. I want to show you a couple of mistakes versus tight ranges that many of you are making. We're going to look at pairs first here, and then we're going to go through different situations here. So let's look at some pairs. First of all, low pairs. Many of you are at the moment cold calling. I'm very sure here from the big blind versus any of these positions, and especially versus tight ranges. What we're going to look for is that if someone is playing an RFI range from early position or MP, most players at the moment are calling hands like 10-7-6-6 or ace-9-6-6 suited to the ace. But these hands are actually supposed to be a fold here. These hands are too disconnected and they match up too poorly against a tight raising range. And especially the fact that the rake is higher makes us want to be more selective and more careful with the hands that we're playing. And hands like this should actually be folded. They should be much better connected and then potentially you can come in for the call. But be aware that hands with like 2, 3, 4 gaps in there, they are very often going to be folded here. Let's look at some high pairs here. Hands like King, King, 10-3 or a Queen, Queen, 6-4. Like these hands are clear calls if the button open raises or if the cutoff open raises, sometimes even if the MP player open raises a wide range. But if someone open raises a tight range, anywhere between 10 and 20%, these hands don't match up too greatly there. You will often be up against aces or strong other hands that do well versus your cold calling range, and you're out of position in a high SPR, which is very disadvantageous for yourself because that's hard to realize your equity with a hand like this that doesn't flop very smoothly. So keep that in mind that these hands against wider ranges, clear call, but against tight ranges when the rake is high, that is what we're talking about here. These hands don't match up well. Too much money of what you invest will be taken away by the poker side, and therefore you cannot win back that much money, and a call doesn't become profitable with hands like this. Let's look at some rundowns versus tight open raising ranges if we're sitting in the big blind here. Let's start off with double suited trash, as I call it. Double suited trash are hands that look very nice, smooth. They have two suits, of course, and it feels you can almost always play these hands. But in reality, you can't. And especially because whenever you're up against a tight RFI range, it's very likely that your opponent is actually holding hands that are dominating you because he's raising 20% of hands, 15% of hands, sometimes even less. It's very likely that the suits that you're playing here are going to be dominated, and therefore you have a lot of reverse implied odds. In combination with a high rake, these hands with a lot of gaps, for example, Queen Jack 7-5 with the Queen high suit only and a 7 high suit, like a 7 high suit is not really helpful here. You need stronger connectivity or you need a higher suit here in order for you to be able to enter the pot here. Otherwise, folding is the play. Lastly, let's look at some single suited trash hands that I call them. For example, Ace Jack 4-3 or King 10-8-6. Like these hands, even though the Ace Jack 3-4, for example, does have an ace high suit, it is on the borderline, this one, whether it's calling or folding. But because you have two wheel cards here, the hand doesn't play too greatly. It's still quite disconnected, and you should be careful with hands similar to this one. Same with King 10-8-6, like you don't have a nut suit. You have 1, 2, 4 gaps in there, and the hands will have problems realizing equity post-flop, and a lot of the rake will get taken away by the poker side. So if you play high stakes or mid stakes, many of these hands are actually fine to call. But at low stakes or small stakes, however you want to call it, these hands should be played very cautiously, and you can only call like a few hands in the big blind. So be aware of that, and just as an important take on this, that the rake does have a significant impact on your passive pre-flop actions, especially cold calling. Okay, let's wrap it up, guys, for today's lesson here. And today was all about defending the big blind. We focused on adjusting based on your opponent's RFI range. That is what's important here. So whenever you're in the big blind, don't call the same hands versus early position than you would do versus a cutoff or a button. Make sure to be aware of the fact where your opponent is open raising from, how many hands he's playing, and adjust accordingly. So against a tight range, you can call less often than against a wide range, where you can call more often. Makes sense, but apparently not many players do it. Secondly, connectivity, extremely important. You want to have hands that are strongly connected and therefore play better out of position in a high SPR and can realize their equity much better. Thirdly, maybe even one of the most important ones here, nuttiness. Because you're out of position in this high SPR against a tight range, you want to have hands that can do very well when it comes to nuttiness, that can be the nuts on the flop or on the turn or on the river, that realize their equity well and do well overall against a tight range here. And remember that you're out of position in a high SPR pot against a strong range. I already mentioned this a couple of times. It's extremely important. And maybe the most important one is the rake is high. So passive pre-flop actions, for example, cold calling is one of them. And we're going to soon talk about facing a 3-bet as well, which is also a passive action issue if you would like to call there. Those passive actions are played extremely different than if you would play at mid or high stakes. When the rake is high and you don't have fold equity here with a passive action, make sure to be tight and selective. Okay, guys, that's going to wrap it up here. Hope you enjoyed this one. Any questions, always, as usual, make sure to use the comment section below, as you do also with other courses, and I'm happy to jump in there. Take care. See you in the next one. Bye-bye. Over and out.